stillness of the mind. The lure of stillness creepypastas have a way of worming into your brain, planting seeds of paranoia that grow long after the story is over. These short horror tales often tap into our deepest fears: loneliness, isolation, and the unknown, delivering them in whispers that never quite leave. One such story, The Stillness, is a perfect example. Its unnerving premise centers on a stillness so profound it becomes a character of its own, one that gnaws away at the boundary between reality and nightmare. This story is inspired by that concept, a narrative that explores a stillness not of the world, but of the mind. A secluded escape. The cabin stood deep in the heart of the woods, miles from the nearest town. It had been abandoned for years, its wooden frame weathered gray by countless storms and biting winters. Its remoteness was exactly what Oliver was looking for. He wasn't running from anything, not exactly. Life had simply become too loud. The ceaseless notifications, the hum of the city, the endless tide of emails. They were a constant pressure on his mind, drowning him in noise. The idea of spending a week disconnected, surrounded by nothing but the quiet of nature, sounded perfect. But the cabin wasn't as silent as he expected. The unsettling beginnings. The first night was uneventful. Oliver spent the evening unpacking, drinking tea by the fireplace, and watching the snow pile up outside the frost-covered windows. The stillness felt serene. It was on the second night that the first strange thing happened. Lying in bed, Oliver had just started to drift off when he heard it. A voice. It was faint, muffled, as if someone were speaking from behind the walls. "Help me," it whispered. Oliver sat bolt upright, his heart pounding. He held his breath, straining to listen. The cabin groaned with the shifting of old wood, but otherwise there was nothing. Convinced it was just his imagination, he rolled over and tried to sleep. But the voice came again the next night. This time, it wasn't faint. It was right beside him. "Help me," it whispered, and Oliver could feel the chill of its breath on his ear, a flicker in the dark. By the fourth day, Oliver began to notice other things. The cabin's old light bulbs had a tendency to flicker, which he'd chalked up to faulty wiring. But one particular light, an old hanging lamp in the living room, did more than flicker. It moved. At first he thought it was swaying because of a draft, though he couldn't feel one. But the movement didn't feel random. It would dim and brighten in a rhythm, as if it were pulsing to some unheard beat. When Oliver tried to touch it, the light would flicker violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. The next time it happened, he stayed frozen in place, watching as the lamp seemed to respond to his presence. It dimmed, brightened, dimmed again, then went out entirely. And in the darkness, Oliver felt something brush past him, eyes in the shadows. By the fifth day, Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He began catching glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shapes darting just out of sight. The windows were the worst. Whenever he walked past them, he swore he could see a pair of eyes staring at him from the darkness outside. But whenever he turned to look, the windows reflected nothing but the empty room behind him. He tried to rationalize it. The isolation, the lack of human interaction. It was playing tricks on his mind. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour, becoming an oppressive weight that pressed down on him even in daylight. By nightfall, he couldn't even bring himself to look out the windows. He closed the curtains, hoping to shut out whatever might be watching. But it didn't help. The eyes weren't outside. They were inside. The fracturing mind. Oliver's sense of reality began to unravel. He started hearing footsteps, slow, deliberate creaks across the wooden floorboards. He'd follow the sound, hoping to catch whatever was making it, but every time he entered the room, he found it empty. The whispers, too, became more frequent. They no longer came at night but echoed through the cabin at all hours, always just out of reach. Sometimes, they called his name. "Oliver," they hissed. Other times they spoke in fragmented sentences, their meaning cryptic and maddening. Stillness. It waits. You'll never leave. It's inside you. Worst of all was the mirror. One evening, while brushing his teeth, Oliver glanced up and froze. His reflection stared back, but its movements didn't match his own. He lifted his hand. His reflection stayed still. For a moment, it simply watched him, its eyes cold and unblinking. Then it smiled. The climax. A question of sanity. By the 6th day, Oliver was on the brink of collapse. He hadn't slept in 2 days, too afraid of what might happen if he closed his eyes. He spent most of his time pacing the cabin, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. That night, the whispers reached a crescendo. They didn't come from the walls anymore. They came from inside his own head. You can't escape. It's already here. Look outside. Against his better judgment, Oliver pulled back the curtains. The snowstorm had cleared, revealing a moonlit landscape. The trees stood still, their black silhouettes unmoving against the pale light. And there, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated. Its face was a blank expanse of pale skin, featureless except for the eyes, 2 black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to send Oliver spiraling into panic. He stumbled back, tripping over the furniture in his rush to get away. But no matter where he ran, the feeling of being watched remained. The whispers grew louder. It's inside you. It's inside you. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his head, trying to drown out the voices. But they weren't coming from outside anymore. They were his own thoughts. And then, he understood. The stillness wasn't in the cabin. It wasn't in the woods. It was in him. The ambiguous ending. When the rescue team arrived a week later, they found the cabin empty. Oliver's car was still parked outside, his belongings untouched. But there was no sign of him. The only clue was a single sentence scrawled on the wall in shaky, uneven handwriting. The stillness took me. No one knows what happened to Oliver. Some believe he succumbed to the isolation, losing himself to madness. Others whisper that the cabin itself is cursed, a place where reality bends and minds shatter. But one thing is certain. If you listen closely on a still, silent night, you might hear it too, the faintest of whispers, calling your name from the darkness. Epilogue. The story leaves us with more questions than answers. Was Oliver a victim of his own mind, or did something darker take him? And what exactly is the stillness? Perhaps it's better not to know. After all, the most terrifying horrors are the ones we can't explain, the ones that linger, silent and unseen, waiting for the moment when we too are alone.